Adventurous Audio. From idea to ear, we make audio an adventure. Just a word of warning, this podcast series contains graphic descriptions and content you may find upsetting from the outset.
Moffat mystery sensation. Victims may be two women. Dumfries, Friday. For 12 days, detectives have been vigorously prosecuting every line of inquiry which could solve the mystery of the deaths of a man and woman whose dismembered bodies were discovered in Gardenholme Lynn ravine near Moffat a week ago last Sunday. And now there has suddenly arisen a doubt as to whether, in fact, the remains were those of a man and a woman or those of two women.
The mystery of the disappearance of Mary Jane Rogerson, the 20-year-old Lancaster nurse girl, has been increased by today's announcement by the Lancaster Borough Police that Dr. Buck Ruxton, the girl's employer, had reported that his wife, Isabella, is also missing.
Mary Jane Rogerson, aged 20, 5 feet 2 inches in height, light brown bobbed hair, blue eyes, a slight glide in one eye, light complexion, medium build, may be wearing a blue coat and pale blue or fawn beret. This girl may be in the company of a woman about 36 years of age who speaks with a strong Scottish accent.
So not one, but two women have been reported missing from the Lancaster area. But who were they? What were the circumstances of their disappearance? And is it possible Body 1 and Body 2 from the Moffat ravine aren't a man and a woman as first thought, but are in fact the missing women, Mary Jane Rogerson and Isabella Ruxton? I'm Pennie Stuart, and this is Inside Forensic Science, a case of stolen identity. Episode 3, The Maid and Her Mistress.
I am unaware at what stage a doubt as to the sex of the victims arose, but 2 days ago, when the fact first came to light that the whole of the torso of what was believed to be the man's body was missing, and not only a part, as had been believed up till then, I made some inquiries regarding the case, particularly as to how it was that the sex of the older victim had been conclusively established from examination of the legs, with the feet missing, the arms with the fingertips missing, and the head. From my inquiries, I gathered that, whilst there's not the slightest doubt from examination of the pelvis that one body was that of a woman, there was the possibility that the other victim, although parts of the body at first examination seemed to be those of a man, might in fact have been a woman with masculine build in certain features.
So bear in mind, the bodies are badly decomposed. So we're not dealing with a pristine body. Bear in mind, he removed the breasts. He removed internal genitalia.
Sue Black, Professor of Anatomy and Forensic Anthropology and the President of St John's College, Oxford.
They knew they had one big person and one small person. And the assumption was the big person was going to be a man and the small person was going to be a woman, I think. And forensic anthropology at that time didn't exist. So it was about the anatomists. But once they'd got the bodies back to the department and they'd started to lay them out and they'd started to piece them together, then it became obvious. And I just wonder if at the scene there was a statement made that was picked up and it then became a rhetoric and a truth until it was changed. And what I mean by that is we're always very cautious when we're at a crime scene not to actually say anything, because a police officer overhearing you may well think that's the truth and they'll head off down a direction. Sometimes things that are overheard or said at a scene can send you down the wrong route.
The excerpts you'll hear throughout the series are taken from the later trial papers.
Did you at any time hold the view that the remains that were found in the ravine at Moffat were those of a man and a woman?
Yes, quite definitely.
And that view, you possibly know, was published?
I believe so.
Had the bodies been assembled then?
No.
What date was that?
We first of all thought that head number 2 was a male, on 1st of October in Moffat. We continued in that belief until, I think, the 10th. On the 11th of October, we had pretty well satisfied ourselves to this extent, that taking the sexual characteristics of the head and the limbs of body number 2, we were probably dealing with a female. And may I add that even up to the present date, with all the investigations which have taken place, that view has never been altered.
There was a stage when you entertained positive doubt. That is to say, you were of the opinion that one was a male and one was a female.
More than one stage, I must confess quite openly.
What's important is that these men of science, and quite often, at that time they were arrogant men of science, were prepared to go, oh, no, we got that wrong. And that, to me, is actually much more reassuring than the fact they got it wrong in the first place. That, to me, was the real test of genuine scientists who were there to get to the truth, not to serve their own ego, not their own reputation or anything like that. It was to do what they were supposed to do.
You've told us you agree with the assembling of the bodies, which was primarily done by Professor Brash.
Yes, exclusively done by him. And I agree with the assembling of the 2 bodies, as far as these could be apportioned.
There were a number of other parts which it is not possible to fix or to attribute definitely to one or other?
Yes. Exhibit 143 deals with the soft parts found. Among the remains, we found 3 breasts which could not be definitely assigned to either body. We considered them at length and could not arrive at any scientific basis for assigning these with accuracy to either one or the other. We found 2 portions of external female genitals representing 2 separate bodies, and a uterus which showed no sign of pregnancy. There is no portion of the female genitals retrieved from the remains from which I could give an opinion that there had been a definite pregnancy.
From your conclusions, what would you say the remains represent?
2 female bodies. From the portions available, I should say that both were well-developed and well-nourished subjects.
It may seem odd that given 3 breasts were found, body 2 was initially thought to be a man. But as we noted in episode 1, body parts continued to be recovered several days, even weeks, after the initial discovery in Gardenholme Lynn. So at the beginning, the experts and investigators were working with incomplete information in the most difficult of circumstances.
The pressures that are on you often at a crime scene are huge. And it's not until you can get away from that and into the sanctuary of the mortuary that you can take the time to really think. But bodies are badly decomposed. They're dealing with little packets of flesh all along the way. It's not easy, this job.
The challenge now for the investigators and experts was how to prove that those little packets of flesh belonged to the women Mary Jane Rogerson and Isabella Ruxton.
Mary was her mother had died, so she had a stepmother and father. She was brought up just outside Manchester. All the stuff describes them as a simple family, which I think is really an awful term.
Janet Tildersley is a volunteer at Moffat Museum and curator of an exhibition about the case.
I think they were a straightforward rural family. Mary was very, very close to her stepmother and father, got a job with the Ruxtons, so she'd be very young, in her late teens, and became very close to Belle and the children. And she would go home every weekend and she would write home. She was in touch with them all of the time.
The Ruxtons Janet was referring to were Isabella Ruxton and her common-law husband, a GP called Dr. Buck Ruxton. They lived, along with their 3 young children, in a grand house which doubled as Buck Ruxton's surgery at 2 Dalton Square in Lancaster. Mary Jane Rogerson was their live-in nursery maid who helped Isabella with the children.
Mrs. Jessie Rogerson. I am the stepmother of Mary Rogerson and reside at 139 Thornton Road, Morecambe. Mary was 20 on the 8th of October 1935. She was employed at Dr. Ruxton's for more than 2 years. I last saw her alive on Thursday 12th of September, the Thursday before Dr. Ruxton told us she had gone to Scotland. That was her day out. On her days out, she did not go anywhere, and she only went about Morecambe a little, and sometimes took her sister with her and sometimes a friend. She always came home. On the last day she came, she went out of the house about 6:30 and went on the pier. She did not return because there was a long queue at the lights at Morecambe, and she was frightened of missing the last bus.
You never saw her again after Thursday, 12th of September?
No.
So Mary's parents hadn't seen her since the 12th of September. According to her employer, Dr. Buck Ruxton, she'd been missing from her workplace since the 15th of September. He said his wife had also gone missing around the same time, and he'd reported it to the police.
The following official description of Mrs. Ruxton has been circulated. Mrs. Isabel Ruxton, 35, about 5 foot 5 inches, or 5 foot 6 inches in height, well built, fair hair, bridge of nose uneven, 3 false teeth on left upper jaw, gold clip shown when smiling, fair complexion, blue eyes, dressed in cream silk blouse, light brown jacket, and skirt dark brown, suede shoes, wearing V-ring on forefinger of left hand, speaks with a strong Scottish accent.
We know a lot more about Belle, and Belle is one of my heroines, really. She was born near Falkirk, moved to Edinburgh, and she was a manageress of a cafe, I think near Princes Street, in the middle of Edinburgh. And she was a really quite a live wire. She was a driver, an experienced driver, which was really quite unusual for a woman in the 20s, really. And she was also a gambler and wanted to run her own betting shop business. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, but she just had tons of character, you know, everybody noticed. She married, I think, in the early 1920s. She fell in love with a Dutch seaman, I think, down in Leith, and that was a very short-lived marriage. But she was running this cafe when in comes this, I would imagine, rather exotic-looking. He was then calling himself Captain Hakim. So and he was, Ruxton was a good-looking man. So he and Belle formed a relationship. They never married. He changed his name by deed poll to Ruxton. She started calling herself Ruxton. She followed him to London and then to Lancaster, had 3 children, had 4 children actually, one was stillborn.
Clara Maureen Gross. I'm employed as a hairdresser at Cheapside, Lancaster. Mrs. Ruxton was one of our customers and I attended to her hair. She came either once, twice or 3 times a week. On 14th September, she came in at 10:15 a.m. And that is the last time she was in the shop. I've attended to her hair for about 2.5 years. Her hair was mid-brown in colour, and at first she had it long and done in a bun at the back of her neck. About 18 months ago, she changed her style and had it in a long bob with just curls at the bottom. Her hair was very soft, and on the top, slightly to the right, there was a grey patch. She had a high forehead, a long jaw and high cheekbones, and her eyes were deep set and grey-blue in colour.
But she maintained her independence. They were a very social couple. I think he was very keen to be the kind of perfect English gent, but she just liked having quite a good time. I think she was very social, and if he wouldn't come with her, she'd just go on her own.
Isabella Ruxton had her own car and regularly visited her sister in Edinburgh.
Mrs. Jeanie Kerr Nelson. Isabella Ruxton was my sister. She was 15 years younger than I and was born in Falkirk on the 3rd of March 1901.
When was the last time she visited you in Edinburgh?
The Sunday previous to 15th September. She came early in the morning in her car. I saw her again in Blackpool on Saturday 14th September. It was in the evening. She took us out to see the lights.
In her car? Up and down?
Yes, we went along the front.
You were always very friendly, you and your sister.
Oh, friendly. I loved my sister.
Your other sister, the 4th one, Mrs. Madden, and her husband, were there also?
Yes.
After the drive, did you go back to the boarding house?
Oh, yes, we got back at almost 11 o'clock. We had a light supper, and it must have been about 11:30 before she left. She left alone and took my handbag with her.
What sort of spirits was she in?
She was in very good spirits until I saw her alone.
On the next day, did your sister come at all to the boarding house?
I waited all day, but she did not come. We went back to Edinburgh on Monday, 16th September, by motor bus. I have never seen my sister again from 11:30 on the Saturday night.
Isabella had been known to head north to Edinburgh several times after arguments with her husband, only to return when things had cooled off. So the idea that she might have taken off wasn't entirely out of character. Except she hadn't appeared in Edinburgh. Her sister hadn't seen her again after the 14th of September. Plus, vanishing without explanation was entirely out of character for young Mary Jane Rogerson.
Has she ever gone away anywhere without your knowledge or your husband's?
No, she had never gone away. Only away to work at Lancaster. She has never missed letting us see her for a week ever. Once she went to a farm with Dr. Ruxton's children for a fortnight, but we knew about it, and she wrote to us nearly every day.
Dr. Buck Ruxton visited Mary's parents on the 25th of September, 10 days after Isabella and Mary had last been seen. And he told them he'd heard a rumour that Mary might be pregnant, which might explain her absence.
I am James Rogerson. I am the father of Mary Rogerson. I said to him, that girl must come back whatever her condition. He said she had mentioned a laundry boy and talked about getting married, but she never mentioned the name of the boy or where he came from or anything. I never saw nor heard in my life that she had a boy, and she never mentioned married. He then said Mrs. Ruxton and Mary will be having a good time. She has 30 or 40 pounds with her, and they will be staying at some big hotel and having a good time. I said I know one girl who will not be having a good time. I told him that if Mary was not back by Saturday, and this was Wednesday, I would report her to the police as a missing girl. And he asked me not to go to the police, that he would bring her back on Sunday.
Which is, of course, exactly what Mary Jane Rogerson's parents did. Only the police didn't act. So they went a step further, and they put an advert in the press, an advert which was picked up by Lieutenant Ewing on the Moffat murders investigation team. But suspecting the bodies found at Gardenholme Lynn could be Mary and Isabella, and actually proving it, are not the same thing. The police still needed more concrete evidence. The investigation team still needed proof of identity.
The various parts of newspapers found being in a wet condition were carefully laid aside, as were the various pieces of cotton sheet, lady's blouse, child's wool and romper or knickers.
Scotsman, 4th of October. The police today invited newspaper correspondents and press photographers to an inspection of 2 garments, a pillow slip and parts of a sheet, all of which were used for wrapping portions of the dismembered bodies. The blouse, which has a V-neck, but which has been torn from neck to waist, had elastic round the foot. The blouse is homemade. The stitching of the neck, collar and cuffs has been hand sewn, the remainder sewn with a machine. Under the left armpit there is a patch, hand sewn. All the hand sewing in the garment is crude, and obviously not the work of a good needleswoman. The other garment is of yellow wool, partially shrunk by water immersion. It's been the trouser part of a child's woolen suit. The junction of the legs had been torn apart. It may be well to point out that these garments, although used as wrappings, may have been obtained by the murderer from elsewhere, and were not necessarily the property of the murdered woman. If anyone, however, recognises the description, the police will welcome further information.
Now the investigation team had names, might it be possible to link the items found with the bodies in Gardenholme Lynn, the blouse, sheet and rompers back to Mary and Isabella in some way.
Do you remember attending a jumble sale at Morecambe in the Memorial Hall?
Yes, I cannot tell you the exact date, as we went to one nearly every Saturday during the back end of the year.
Do you recognise that blouse?
Yes, I bought that at the jumble sale. I know it because I put a patch under the arm. I took it home, washed it, and I gave it to Mary a week or two after, and she took it away with her. This would be before Christmas 1934. I have never seen her with it on, but it would be amongst her goods at the Ruxtons.
I'm Mrs. Edith Edna Maud Home. I live at the cottage, Settle, Grange over Sands, and during the summer I let rooms to visitors. I first saw Dr. Ruxton on the 5th of June 1935 when he came to my house with a party of friends. He came on the 8th with his wife, 2 children and the maid, and the children and the maid stayed with me for a fortnight. Dr. and Mrs. Ruxton visited them usually on Wednesdays and sometimes on Saturdays and Sundays. Altogether I saw Dr. Ruxton about 7 or 8 times. He always came by car. This pair of rompers were mine. I got them for my little boy from a Mrs. Perry and gave them to Mary Rogerson. I recognised them in every way, especially by the knot which I made when I put the elastic in, the old elastic being worn.
Although the blouse and woolen rompers provide a link to Mary, the fact that they were found wrapping the body parts in the ravine doesn't prove those body parts belonged to Mary. It just indicates that items she's been in contact with at some point were used by the person who disposed of the bodies. The investigation turned to the Ruxtons' house at Dalton Square in Lancaster, where they recovered bedsheets and other fabric. Fred Wilkinson Barwick was a director at the Testing House and Laboratory of the Manchester Chamber of Commerce, and the investigation team drew on his expertise to see if there might be a link between the torn sheets found wrapping the body parts and bedsheets from the Ruxtons' house.
I'm a director of the Testing House and Laboratory for the Manchester Chamber of Commerce, and I've held that position for over 20 years. On 1st of November 1935, I received 4 pieces of sheet, 2 pieces of M and a bedsheet. I have compared the portions of the soiled sheet and the strips of M with the bedsheet produced, and find that in composition, weave, weight, thread per inch, counter-component yarns, directionate twist-on yarn, turns per inch in yarn, and the class of cotton, there are no differences. The selvage is the strengthening portion running down length of sheet, and in order to make the sheet stronger, the threads are woven in a different order. There are 26 threads working in pairs at the extreme edge, and that, apparently, is the normal selvage which the manufacturer intended to use. But only one selvage is like that. The other selvage has 3 threads missing. A fault like this would not be noticeable except under a microscope.
So we have to understand a bit about how a fabric is woven.
Chris Gannicliffe is forensic lead for biology within Scottish Police Authority Forensic Services.
So what you have are lots of parallel yarns extending from the loom. So those run or will run the length of the fabric. So those are called warp yarns, and they will run the length of the fabric once it's eventually woven. So those emerge as an array of parallel yarns. And then what you do then is, at right angles to that, you weave a different yarn. So that's called a weft yarn, and that ducks in and out and works its way across and ducks in and out alternately across the warp yarns, interlacing them together. It's usually pulled by something like a shuttle or something like that, as it's called, which pulls the yarn across. Once it gets to the end, then it has to turn back, and then it forms another row. And then once it gets to the end, it forms another row. So it works its way down, going backwards and forwards across these longitudinal warp yarns. So weaving in and out. When it gets to the end and it ducks back, that's what's known as the selvage. So that's basically is the longitudinal edge of the fabric that's finished in some way. Otherwise it would just unravel once you had your fabric. So you need to finish it in some way. So it might duck around the edge and duck around and then heads back again, basically. Now, the way you might construct a selvage, you might try and make it a bit stronger by having more warp yarns running down the length of it that are thicker in that area, or they might be closer together. So Fred speaks about how there's 24 or 20, whatever it is, that number of in that area. And basically what he's talking about is that at the end, there is a grouping of those that are closer together forming the selvage. But the defect has meant that it's a different number on one side than it is on the other. And he speaks about how that will only exist temporarily. The reason being that on that loom, at that particular time, it's creating that defect. But once the spools, because each of those warp yarns are coming off a different spool, once those spools are replenished, it won't exist anymore. It'll then be repaired, and then that won't exist. So as long as those spools are feeding off and we have that defect, it's only in that time that presumably you're then going to see this discrepancy between the left and the right, so to speak, the different selvages on each side. As soon as those spools are replaced, that disappears.
So you've only got a very limited amount of fabric that will display that defect, which massively narrows down, or the chances, I suppose, of having that fabric with that defect appearing both in the house at Dalton Square and wrapping the body parts.
That's right, and that's the advantage of an industry expert in something like this, because they can't just explain the technology of how it's constructed, but they can probably answer questions like, well, how much fabric would this have created? Well, how many items would that have then made? And so he would have been able to say, well, it would be X number of sheets before those spools would have run out. So immediately you've narrowed that figure down into some tangible way that the court can relate to. So immediately they're able to say, well, there's only that number that are going to look like that, and where they've been sold, and how many of those are there around. So immediately you're narrowing that field down.
So the bed sheets, romper and blouse all link the bodies in the ravine to the house in Dalton Square. But if this were a contemporary case, there would be a much greater level of analysis and analytical tools available to the forensic team.
In this case, they looked at a fairly basic, fundamental level, which is simply that does that fabric that's found with the body parts correspond to the bed sheets in its construction? And we had the blouse and the romper suit as well. What we pay far more attention to these days is contaminant fibres on those that would link them to a common source. So secondary transfer, by which fibres are transferred onto an item, and that item acts as an intermediary, and then those fibres are transferred from that item onto the next item. So if you have body parts that are being discarded, being dumped, the first thing you might be asking is not just about the bit of fabric that they're wrapped in, but does that bear fibres that would link to a household or to the car? So transported in a car, would they bear fibres on them that come from the car boot, for example? Would they bear fibres on them from the household from which they came? Because, in all likelihood, they might bear carpet fibres, for example. We nowadays would look to recover fibres by fibre taping, applying strips of adhesive tape to the fabric and recovering contaminating fibres on it. We'd then look at those and group them into what we call collectives. So other groups or populations of fibres that appear to have a common source. So let's say, for example, we see a population of purple wool fibres. And we might say, well, I wonder where those are from. They obviously seem to come from a single item. Might that be an item within the household from which they came? So a common source might be carpet fibres, for example, these days. Now, not at that time. Carpets at that time would be far more likely to be natural. These days, you might have big fat nylon or polypropylene fibres that you'd immediately recognise and say, they're from a carpet. So that's really important information, particularly in an undetected inquiry, because you can feed that to the police and say, you're looking for a household with this sort of carpet. So these days we'd be looking not just at the actual fabric itself, but what contaminates it that might indicate a link back to the household in the way of fibre evidence and take us back to whatever the body's been lying on in, the person who's handled the body, what they've transferred onto it as well. So there's lots of links there back to the household, but wouldn't have been apparent at the time because it simply didn't have the ability to recover that trace evidence and to identify it.
The evidence is starting to mount up. The bedsheet, rompers and blouse all link the bodies to the house at Dalton Square. But it still didn't allow the investigators to confirm the identities of Body 1 and Body 2, although now the experts had something concrete to work with. photographs of the women. They knew their ages, how tall they were. They had accurate descriptions of them.
Well, at the time, of course, this was before any DNA identification was possible.
Caroline Wilkinson is a professor of craniofacial identification and director of the Forensic Research Institute at Liverpool John Moores University.
So this particular case was difficult for the police because the murderer had ensured that many items that could be used for identification had been removed. So a lot of the face had been removed, a lot of the teeth had been removed, a lot of identifying features on other body parts had been removed.
There were certain peculiarities about both these women to which I wish to draw your attention. And if these marks were left after death, anyone would be able to identify these persons. Mary Rogerson had what is commonly called a glide in one eye. The eyes had been removed. She had had certain teeth drawn by a dentist, a fact which could have been identified by the dentist. More extractions had been made on the body, and these had been made about the time of her death. She had suffered from tonsillitis. This body shows that the person was so suffering. She had 4 vaccination marks on her left arm. A piece of skin was found with 4 vaccination marks, which Mr. Rogerson says tallies with the marks of his daughter's left arm. She had a very bad birthmark on her right arm, a very noticeable mark. The flesh on that forearm had been cut away. She had an operation.
The bodies had been taken apart, and it was unclear to the police necessarily which part belonged to which body, and as well as proving identification and murder, they also had to distinguish between the 2 bodies, and that created a whole host of problems.
Although the police weren't able to easily identify Mary and Isabella from the body parts, pioneering science might offer them a way forward.
They basically had 2 skulls, 2 bodies, but primarily for this 2 skulls, and they wanted to identify if any was Isabella Ruxton and which was Mary Rogerson, her maid. So the Gleason and Brash, who did the work on the craniofacial analysis, found a way of superimposing an image of the skull with an ante-mortem photograph images that had been taken of the 2 women, so that they could see whether or not each skull matched with the ante-mortem face. And in doing that, they've kind of made a process that was really good for excluding and gave good support to it being an individual. And this is quite difficult for them to do. So they had 4 photographs basically that they used, 2 of each woman, and they looked at the angle of the head in the photograph and tried to match that with a view of the skull so that they could then superimpose and look for consistency between facial features and detail. But that in itself is quite a difficult thing to do, to match an angle of a skull to an angle of a head in the photograph, not least because they didn't have a scale on the photographs. These were just photographs that were taken live, if you like, without any standardized equipment. But rather cleverly, what they did was they scaled the photograph based on known things in the photograph that they could measure. One of those was a tiara that Isabella Ruxton was wearing in one of the photographs, and they got that tiara, they measured it, and therefore they could scale the photograph. And for the Mary Rogerson photographs, they went back to the scene where the photograph was taken and took more photographs using a measuring stick. Now, they acknowledged this was not as accurate as having a known item that they could measure in the photograph, but that was the best they could do to scale. So certainly the Isabella Ruxton scale was very accurate, and the Mary Rogerson one was more approximate. And then that enabled them to print out either negative or positive photographs at scale that they could then mount in front of the skull on a stand and then rotate the skull in any direction to match up with the photograph.
These are photographs of the two skulls as I cleaned them and prepared them for photography. These two skulls are oriented, that is, placed in the same position.
When they were happy with that alignment, they could then take an image of the skull and then they could superimpose negative and positive images of the skull and the photographs so that they could look at consistency.
So are there particular indicators that experts like Caroline look to match up?
So broadly, comparative proportions are what we're looking for, to make sure that the features like the eyes, the nose, the mouth are all in the correct position relative to each other. So that's first of all what you do. So if you superimpose a skull and you match up the eyes, the nose and the mouth and the chin is sticking way below the photograph, then you don't really need to look at detail because the overall proportions are telling you that there's no match. If there's similarity in facial feature positions and broad proportions, then you might start to look at detail. And detail is usually things like teeth in position that match up, especially if you can see teeth in photographs. And fantastically, people often smile when they have a photograph taken, so you often get to see some teeth. So if you can match those up, then that's a very good identifying characteristic. And then other detail that might be characteristic to that person. So, for example, any asymmetry. So if the nose deviates in one direction and you can see that it deviates in one direction on the bone, then that matches up. If one eye is higher than the other and that matches up, then all of those details can be used as characteristic to that individual. Having said that, it is quite difficult in these cases to positively identify, because there's many things about the face that you don't know from a skull. And there are many features that happen throughout somebody's life that are to do with aging that wouldn't necessarily be reflected in the skeletal structure. So although it's a really good process for excluding, because if things don't match, it can't possibly be the same person, it's not 100% positive identification. It just gives support to a match.
In my opinion, these demonstrate conclusively, in the first place, that skull number 1 could not possibly be the skull of Mrs. Ruxton. They also demonstrate, in my opinion, that skull number 2 might be the skull of Mrs. Ruxton.
If you want to see a picture of the evidence resulting from Brash's superimposition of the skull and photograph of Isabella Ruxton, we've put a link in the show notes. I think it's pretty striking, but see what you think. And remember, at the time, this was nothing short of pioneering, a technique which pushed at the frontiers of forensic science.
Before this case, the majority of these kind of procedures were carried out for authentication of historical figures. Johann Sebastian Bach and Oliver Cromwell their remains were both authenticated, or death mask in the case of Oliver Cromwell, by comparison with portraits. But that's a very different thing to comparing with photographs. There was a case prior to this in the US around 1931, 1932, where this was carried out in a forensic case by way of an identification. But certainly in the UK, this was the first time that this was used.
So just how accurate is this area of science?
A little while ago, there was a European consortium that got European funding to look into this. So this included practitioners and researchers from across Europe and wider, actually, who got together and used what's described as ground truth data, which is basically computer tomography data of living individuals, to do, first of all, an evaluation of the methodology and then an evaluation of the accuracy of that methodology. So, yeah, we do know how accurate the systems are and where the levels of subjective opinion come in. I think the difficulty with craniofacial superimposition is the level of confidence that people have in a positive match, rather than exclusion, which is it's much safer in terms of these comparisons.
Skull number 2 could not possibly be the skull of Miss Rogerson, but skull number 1 might be.
If you look at the images, then you'll appreciate why the level of confidence in matching the skull from body 2 to Isabella ended up being fairly high. But none of that detailed and complex work yielded instant results. Plus, remember, it was a new science. So even when the compelling evidence that body 2 might be Isabella did come through, the investigation team weren't about to rely on just that to progress the case. They needed more, particularly when it came to body 1. If the investigation can identify body 1 as Mary, then that will back up the theory that body 2 is indeed Isabella, especially given the women disappeared around the same time. But how to prove body 1 was Mary? And if body 1 and body 2 are indeed Mary and Isabella, what happened? Why were they murdered? And by who? As we'll hear in the next episode, it was another field of pioneering forensic science which provided the investigation with the evidence they needed.
In this case, there are a number of investigative priorities that would stand out to me. One of those is we still haven't identified these bodies. So you have to have some way of tying those deceased women back to the house.
In episode 3 of Inside Forensic Science, A Case of Stolen Identity, the experts were Janet Tildersley, Chris Gannicliffe and Professor Caroline Wilkinson. The actors were Mary Hemsworth, Yana Miller, Chris Young, Neil Wallace, Dan Holland, Jake Lee, Sam Young, Alan Wall, Ali Elam, Pam McIntosh, Andy Utley, Alan Richardson, Heather Duran, James Hitchmo and Mark Stephen. Inside Forensic Science is written and narrated by me, Pennie Stuart. The story consultants and researchers are Heather Duran and Clara Morris. The series is mixed by Steve Ball. Inside Forensic Science is an Adventurous audio production for the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science at the University of Dundee and is funded by the Leverhulme Trust.